Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rhine, following Europe's greatest river from Amsterdam to the Alps, by Ben Coates, narrated by Ciaran Saward. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type The Rhine into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code HISTORY and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters.
Introduction. Liquid City, Amsterdam and the Delta. About a year after I arrived in the Netherlands, it began to snow. Not the drizzly slush which usually falls in Western Europe these days, but proper snow, of the kind which I hadn't seen since I was a child. Big flakes which settled wherever they landed, carpeting the streets of Rotterdam like foam on the surface of a bath. Within a few hours, the streets around my home were coated with a thick layer of white powder, and the canals had frozen solid. The trams stopped running, and most of the shops were closed. The Dutch, it seemed, had returned to the Ice Age. I'd moved to the Netherlands in 2010, through a strange combination of whim and good fortune. A flight which was carrying me from Peru to London had been diverted due to bad weather, and I ended up moving in with the young Dutch lady who'd offered me a place to stay for the night. Within a few months of my unexpected arrival, I'd become surprisingly well integrated. I had a Dutch job, house, and girlfriend, and was beginning to speak the language pretty well. However, the change of weather thrust me abruptly back into the role of stranger in a strange land. The Netherlands, which I'd been getting to know, looked suddenly unfamiliar again, and I felt strangely unsure of how to behave. In England, I knew the protocol. Any hint of snow, and I'd call in sick to work, grab a toboggan or snowboard, and head for the hills. But what did one do in a snowy place where downhill sports are out of the question, because the highest hills are barely tall enough for a dog to hide behind? The answer, according to my Dutch girlfriend, was obvious. Get some ice skates. At first it seemed like a ridiculous idea. I hadn't skated in years, and in my native Britain ice skating was a minority pursuit anyway, something done only by teenagers on awkward first dates or by couples in sequined leotards competing for trophies. In the Netherlands, though, the opposite was true. Ice skating was apparently almost as popular as drinking coffee and eating cheese. Almost every Dutch person I spoke to had a pair of ice skates stashed somewhere, even if they didn't get to use them very often. And skating champions were revered in the way star footballers or Olympic sprinters might be in other countries. During rare cold spells, the news would be dominated by endless speculation about the chances of holding an Elfstedentocht, 11 cities tour, following the frozen canals for more than 100 miles through the north of the Netherlands. In my first year in the Netherlands, I'd worked hard to understand and assimilate with the society I'd joined, drinking tiny little glasses of beer, talking unnecessarily loudly, and eating sandwiches for breakfast. Now, taking up ice skating seemed like a logical next step towards integration. And so I succumbed to peer pressure and trekked across a white-jacketed city to a run-down little sports shop somewhere down by the River Maas. Inside, an old man with a Joe Stalin moustache quickly convinced me to spend a week's salary on some top-of-the-range skates, enormous boaty things which looked like plastic ski boots with stiletto blades welded underneath, ready to slice open anyone who dared to make fun of them. I carried my new toys home under my jacket, hid them under the bed, and asked my girlfriend, now my wife, not to tell anyone I had them. The next day, I walked to the end of my road, sat on the edge of a small river, and nervously strapped myself in. The streets were quiet, muffled by the thick carpet of snow, and no one else was around. The ice on the river seemed very thick, about 4 inches, as far as I could tell, and I lowered myself gingerly onto it. After a few wobbly minutes, I was off, making thin black tracks through the white candy floss coating the top of the canal. I'd never really paid much attention to the small river which passed close to my house, the Rotter, for which the city of Rotterdam is named, but now realized it actually stretched for miles, heading way out into the countryside and connecting with other channels, big and small. Scooting low under a railway bridge, I headed north, out of the city, past ancient windmills and boats straitjacketed by ice. After 2 hours of skating, I still hadn't run out of road. I stopped and bought a glass of strong, syrupy glühwein and drank it, sitting on the ice for a while, before skating on towards the horizon. Strange as it may sound, that day on the ice was the first time I'd ever thought of Dutch rivers as things which actually led somewhere. In other countries, I'd often used rivers as a way of getting from one place to another. In nearly a decade of indolent backpacking, I'd sailed along the Nile from Aswan to Cairo, rafted the Ganges, Trishuli and Pakwari, and ridden ferries along the Zambezi, Yangtze and Mekong. In the Netherlands, however, it was easy to think of rivers as mere background noise, rather than significant features of the landscape. Centuries after the Dutch began their great project to reclaim land from the sea, the country was still covered with an extraordinary amount of water, with countless canals, streams, drainage ditches and artificial lakes crisscrossing the country. Walking and cycling along and over them every day, I'd grown used to ignoring them, never thinking about what they actually were. Blue highways leading to other places. Within a few days of my skating trip, all the ice had melted, but I was captivated by what I'd seen. An alternate map of my adopted home country in which rivers, rather than roads or railways, were the main arteries connecting communities. I wondered, if I kept following the rivers, how far could I go? One day, in the Rotterdam library, I looked at a few maps of the region and found the answer. Quite far. The Rotter River on which I'd skated was actually a minor tributary of the Maas, which itself formed much of the lower reaches of the River Rhine. This meant I could, in theory, skate, run, swim or cycle along the river, not just as far as a Glühwein stop a few hours from home, but all the way across the Netherlands, into Germany and beyond. All the way, in fact, to the top of the Swiss Alps, half a continent away. A few years previously, I'd lived for a while not far from the Nile in Uganda, and had become briefly fascinated with tales of Victorian explorers who set out to find the mythical source of the river, trekking for months through unexplored wildernesses. Obviously, exploring the Rhine wasn't quite in the same league, but following it all the way to its source had a pleasing purity of purpose. To live entwined with one of the world's most famous rivers, yet never to see its source, seemed like living next to a great cathedral, but never going inside, or dwelling at the foot of a mighty mountain, but never seeing its summit. I already fancied I knew the Rhine region well. Writing a previous book about the Netherlands, I'd explored one small stretch of the river in detail, travelling by boat and train from a ridiculous reconstruction of Noah's Ark in Dordrecht to the great flood defences near the North Sea. Further afield, I also knew much of the German Rhine well, having visited cities like Bonn, Düsseldorf and Cologne perhaps every other month for several years, for both work and pleasure. As a student and underpaid political aide, I'd spent a couple of happy summers exploring Alsace and the southern Rhineland, and later, as overpaid speechwriter and lobbyist, new to the Netherlands and missing the mountains, had flown numerous times for weekends in the Swiss Alps, Austria and Liechtenstein. However, there were still many stretches of the river which I'd never seen, and I knew less than I'd like to about the region's history and culture. A journey up and down the river seemed like an irresistible opportunity to explore further and learn more. I began studying maps and guidebooks, and planning to travel the whole way along the river by bike, boat, train and foot. I bought maps, found apartments to rent in various Rhine cities, and braced myself for long days on the road and long nights in the bar. When the summer came, I thought, I'd set out along the river, following it from the Netherlands all the way to its mountain source. Rowing, like making your own pasta or pretending not to have a hangover, was harder than it looked. The first few strokes went well enough, but as my borrowed rowing boat picked up speed, I quickly found myself slaloming from side to side across the river like an out-of-control skier. no matter how hard I tried, it was impossible to get both oars to push neatly through the water at the same time without sending great tidal waves of spray towards nervous pedestrians on the riverbank. I'd worked in Amsterdam on and off for years, and knew the city well, but thought taking to the water might offer new perspective. I was right. From water level on the River Amstel, things looked very different than they did from the street. The normally hectic city was quiet, and the small Dutch houses which lined the water loomed high overhead like skinny mountains with red-tiled peaks. I rowed clumsily northwards, splashing and cursing my way towards the steeples of Amsterdam's old city centre. One oar clunked clumsily against a stone wall as another skimmed uselessly across the surface, and I looked enviously at a green-headed duck as he paddled effortlessly by. Luckily, the weather was, by Dutch standards, spectacular, which is to say, neither windy nor rainy, and only a little grey. There were few boats moving on the river, but I passed dozens of houseboats, each moored to the riverbank, with its own little bridge and pot plants on the roof. Some were beautiful old Dutch barges, thick bananas of black-painted steel, sitting proudly above the waterline, but most were more ordinary, one-storey wooden cubes, like floating garden sheds. The architecture was mundane, but the locations were spectacular, and this was reflected in the prices. A typical Amsterdam houseboat could cost far more than a similarly sized apartment. Slipping slowly under a bridge, I was swiftly overtaken by a Dutchman of about my age in a kayak, gliding effortlessly home from the supermarket with a cargo of grocery bags. I fumbled with my oars and waved a greeting, and he gave me a wry nod, as if to say, "You clearly don't belong here." As always, I was amazed by how much life there was on the water. A dozen young people cruised by in a motor dinghy, happily flirting with one another and drinking little plastic cups of orange Aperol. Then came an old man in a motorboat with a black dog asleep in the bow, hollering at the youngsters as he passed. "Watch out! There's a police speed check around the corner!" Some fishermen on the bank were inflating a small boat, and I remembered the day, a few months previously, when I'd encountered a fellow youngish Englishman on a bridge near here, busily inflating the plastic children's dinghy which he'd just bought at a nearby supermarket. Once the boat was inflated, he loaded it with a dozen cans of Heineken and wriggled in, his legs hanging precariously over the sides like a giraffe in a bathtub. I asked tentatively what he was doing, and he shouted over his shoulder as he drifted away between the big barges while cracking open a beer. "Having a proper cruise, innit?" In many ways, Amsterdam was an absurd place for me to begin my exploration of the Rhine. As several people had pointed out, the location generally considered the mouth of the Rhine lay not in Amsterdam, but some 50 miles to the southwest, on the North Sea coast at Hoek van Holland. However, my choice of starting point wasn't entirely as ridiculous as it appeared. While some rivers follow a direct course from A to B, the Rhine is a little more complex. From its source at Lake Thoma, high in the Swiss Alps, this river flows down through a small piece of Switzerland into the micronation of Liechtenstein before continuing briefly northwards through Austria and into the pearl-like Lake Constance. Technically, this account is an oversimplification, and there are several points in Switzerland at which the river could be said to begin. However, Lake Thoma is generally accepted as the primary source of the Vorderrhine, or anterior Rhine. Leaving Constance, the Rhine then heads west into Switzerland again, before abruptly turning north at Baal, serving as the Franco-German border for a while, and then heading lustily northwards through the left flank of Germany. That might already seem complicated enough, but after crossing the border into the freewheeling Netherlands, the Rhine becomes even more anarchic, fracturing into a vast cobweb of smaller channels, some man-made and some natural, with names which could make an English speaker swallow their tongue. The Eisel, Nederrhein, Benede Merwede, and Deutsche Kill. The only river actually called the Rhine in the Netherlands is a small stream which trundles through the centre of the country, while the Dutch river which carries most of the Rhine's cargoes to the sea is called the Maas, and the vast delta of the southern Netherlands is known as the Rhine-Maas-Scheldt Delta. For a novice hydrographer, it was all quite confusing. but it's sufficient to say that the Rhine delta covers much of the southwestern Netherlands, and waters originating in the German Rhine are found all over the place. The Dutch map is littered with names inspired by the river and its tributaries. Rijnsaterwoude, Rijnsburg, Rijndijk, Alphen on the Rijn, Nieuwebrug on the Rijn, and the country's most famous painter, born in the city of Leiden, is Rembrandt von Rijn. Amsterdam, Vlissingen, and Deventer all lie in different corners of the Netherlands, but drop a rubber duck in Cologne, and it could well end up bobbing through any of them. From above, the Dutch Rhine looks less like a road leading neatly from A to B, and more like a glass of beer spilled in an Amsterdam bar, messily spreading its way across the floorboards towards the doorway. For me personally, the main result of this confusing geography was it made my route planning difficult. Who could say where the Rhine really ended and where my journey should begin? After much studying of maps, I ended up choosing a route which seemed both geographically reasonable and fun. A quick pootle around Amsterdam before heading briefly southwards along bits of the tiny Oude Rijn through North and South Holland to the wide river mouth at Hoek van Holland. From there, I could travel more slowly along the Nieuwe Maas, Lek and Nederrijn to the Dutch-German border, and then along the Rhine proper, through Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria and Liechtenstein, all the way to the source. Throughout this book, I take a few lexicographical liberties with the names of places to which I travel. Firstly, I occasionally describe stretches of water as being part of the Rhine, even if they're technically part of the numerous channels which make up the fractured Rhine delta, such as the Waal. Secondly, I generally rely on present-day place names and borders, referring, for example, to something which happened in Germany in 1800, even though the unified country of Germany didn't exist at that time. Thirdly, as an Englishman writing in English, I use anglicised place names. For example, Cologne rather than Köln, and Bâle rather than Basel. These shortcuts may infuriate pedantic geographers, but should make things much easier to follow. Amsterdam wasn't known as a major Rhine city, but it was nourished indirectly by the waters of the Rhine, kept supplied with tourists by countless Rhine cruise ships, and linked to the river by a long canal. In that context, it seemed as good a place as any to start. A second reason for starting in Amsterdam was that the city, perhaps more than anywhere else in the Netherlands, epitomized the way in which rivers like the Rhine shaped the lifestyles of the people living alongside them. Amsterdam is thought to have arisen as a small fishing village in the 13th century, based around a pair of dikes on either side of the River Amstel, which were eventually linked together by a bridging dam, the Amstel Dam. It was at first a pretty sleepy place, but that began to change rapidly in the 1580s, when a blockade of Antwerp led to much trade being diverted to Amsterdam and sent Protestant refugees flooding northwards in search of new freedoms and opportunities. In half a century, the population of the city roughly tripled. By the late 16th century, Dutch explorers and traders were fanning out across the globe in search of new territory and riches. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was formally established in 1602 and quickly bloomed into a world-spanning colossus, a 17th century version of Shell or General Motors. The Dutch became what the author Daniel Defoe described as the carriers of the world, running trading posts everywhere from present-day Indonesia to Taiwan, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, and North America. The Dutch founded New York City, naming Brooklyn and Harlem after small towns in their homeland, bumped into Australia, and discovered New Zealand, naming the latter after the southern Dutch province of Zeeland. At home, they also embarked on a wildly ambitious project to physically rebuild their country, pumping lakes dry and reclaiming swathes of the boggy Rhine-Maas delta. For most of the 17th century, the Dutch were trapped in a blissful, virtuous cycle. Foreign trade generated rich profits which could be invested in new boats and expeditions, and land reclamation unlocked new land which earned money to invest in more reclamation. The Dutch guilder was, like the dollar or Bitcoin, accepted as currency all around the world. In Amsterdam, the wealth of this golden age transformed the city. It grew quickly from a relative backwater into one of the biggest metropolises in Europe, a bustling, cosmopolitan place where dozens of languages were spoken and riverside wharves were packed with exotic spices, fabrics, and foods. Around the original Amsterdam, on Dam Square, concentric canals were dug and equipped with complex series of locks and sluices, which meant they could regularly be flushed clean, with fresh water flowing from one side of the city to another. The most prominent water features were given grandiose aspirational names: the Herengracht, Gentleman's Canal; Prinsengracht, Prince's Canal; and Keizersgracht, Emperor's Canal. Newly wealthy merchants built canal-side houses which were modest in size but majestic in style, as narrow and deep as books on a shelf. Foreign visitors were astonished by what they saw in the Venice of the north. Artists, innovators, and poets, soaring churches, neat bridges, and above all, canals. As in any country, it was almost impossible to untangle all the influences which had shaped the Netherlands' culture, but it was fair to say that almost everything which an outsider might think of as quintessentially Dutch could be traced directly back to the influence of rivers like the Rhine. Windmills were made to pump boggy areas dry, and dikes built to hold the water back. The flat green fields reclaimed from the water provided food for dairy cows, who produced gallons of milk. Cheese was made from the milk, and tulips grown in the fields. Streets were paved with bricks so they wouldn't crack when the reclaimed ground subsided. The Dutch themselves used bicycles to ride along the flat sides of canals and the tops of dikes, wore clogs to protect against the silty mud, and grew tall from all the milk and cheese. Perhaps most importantly, the waterways which crisscrossed the country were the major source of its prosperity, the golden ticket, which made a rain-soaked corner of Europe a cultural and economic superpower. Water, once the greatest enemy of the Dutch, ended up making them rich, and Amsterdam one of the most picturesque and profitable cities in the world. Abandoning the unwieldy rowing boat, I continued northwards on foot, following the Amstel and then turning west along the Herengracht Canal. The outer fringes of Amsterdam were a confusing sprawl, but as a pedestrian, the old centre was still delightfully easy to navigate, with the 4 major canals circling Dam Square like rings on a dartboard. I arrived in the area known as the Negen Straatjes, 9 little streets, a delightful warren of 17th century townhouses, cafes, and boutiques. I hadn't walked through this part of Amsterdam for more than a year, and thought I could detect a change. The city had long been famous as a place of refuge and recreation, but in recent years had risked getting a bit rough around the edges, with a few too many visitors coming to do fun things which were illegal back home. In response, the city authorities had begun closing brothels, increasing tourist taxes, and tightening drug laws. Inevitably, the changes were hotly debated, and the authorities struggled to strike the right balance. Too much tolerance of excess, and Amsterdam might become thuggish and seedy, but too little, and it risked becoming an insipid Potemkin village, where loved-up couples loved to wander, but it was hard for Dutch people to actually live or work. It may have been my imagination, but the result seemed a modest improvement. Amsterdam's streets were a little cleaner than they had been in the past, and the atmosphere a little calmer. There was still an amazing number of tourists, but the old city was wonderful. Brick-lined canals, ancient townhouses, and thousands of bicycles, weaving along the narrow streets like fish in a stream. In the usual Amsterdam way, many people were sitting outside their houses on their own front steps, sharing bottles of wine and eating little cubes of cheese as the world bustled by just a few feet away. At midday, on a rather grey Tuesday, the whole city had the bohemian air of a park on a sunny Sunday, and the locals looked like after pictures in an advert for a fitness regime. I stopped to take a photo of a bridge just as a girl of about 6 announced loudly to her mother, in Dutch, "Oh, what a beautiful bridge! I think it's very, very, very old, like from the 1960s. Near the Westerkerk, Western Church, I found a nice cafe and sat outside on the cobbles, drinking herbal tea which tasted like canal water. My spoken Dutch was decent but patchy, but when the waitress realized I was English, she complimented me on it lavishly. Not for the first time, I was glad to have been born in a country where language skills were in short supply. For a Dutch person to be considered fluent in English, they had to be able to recite Shakespearean sonnets by heart, but for Englishmen to be fluent in Dutch, they merely had to order a drink. My tea finished, I kept walking east from the Westerkerk towards De Wallen, through deep canyons formed by black-painted ancient houses. Like all the best cities, Amsterdam felt more like a village than a great metropolis. In the space of 30 minutes, I'd walked halfway across it and seen 3 people I knew, acquaintances who were all bemused to learn where I planned to go next. "Following the rivers to the Alps?" one of them said. "Why do you want to do that? Can't you just take the train?" My acquaintance's low opinion of the Rhine wasn't unusual. In years gone by, few would have doubted the importance of such a great river. When roads were bad, rivers offered an easy way to transport goods and people. When populations were growing, rivers offered food to keep them fed. When great factories were growing, rivers provided water for power and cooling. And when wars were common, rivers provided natural moats to keep invaders out and ways of moving soldiers to wherever their deadly skills were needed. Well into the 20th century, many Europeans would have seen a river near their home as being like oxygen or Wi-Fi, something it was impossible to live without. In the 21st century, though, rivers have rather fallen from favour. In an era when tulips can be flown from Kenya to Amsterdam overnight, peace treaties negotiated by teleconference, wars fought by drone, and products printed using blueprints downloaded from China, the idea that the slow, steady flow of water and ships might help shape nations has come to seem rather quaint. In Europe, rivers have become mild curiosities rather than major national assets. Nice places to walk a dog or relax with a coffee, but considerably less important than oxygen or Wi-Fi. Of course, this isn't to say the world is completely disinterested in rivers. Politicians and diplomats still lose sleep over the control of the Tigris and Euphrates, and fret over proposals to control the Nile, divert the Mekong, or dam the Congo. But the Rhine never quite gets the attention it deserves. Magisterial histories of Europe barely mention it, and Europeans shrug when it's discussed. Younger Dutch people, in particular, often seem oddly prejudiced against the Rhine region, dismissing its cities as boring, even as they flock to nearby rivals such as Paris and Berlin. In the 21st century, the Rhine has become like Buddhism or the bond market, something which everyone has heard of, but few people really know much about. In an age of hyperbole, the Rhine also suffers from comparison with behemoths like the Amazon or Congo. Viewed through another lens, however, it's easy to argue that it is one of the greatest of them all, one of the major axes around which world history turns. Winding its way some 800 miles through Europe, it's the second longest river in Central and Western Europe, behind only the Danube. Altogether, around 50 million people live in its watershed, nearly as many as live in Italy. It has also inspired some of history's most famous writers, poets, artists, diplomats, and statesmen, often serving as a fulcrum of European war and history. The Rhine, as Victor Hugo wrote, is unique. It combines the qualities of every river, mysterious like the Nile, spangled with gold like an American river, and, like a river of Asia, abounding with phantoms and fables. To a certain extent, all rivers serve a dual purpose. Along their length, they unite, but across their breadth, they divide. The Rhine is no exception. Along its length, it forms a key artery of Europe's trade system, one of the major outlets through which Dutch, German, French, and Swiss industries ship their products to the world. The port at Rotterdam is by far the busiest in Europe, handling well over 1 million tons of cargo a day, more than twice as much as its nearest rival. It's perhaps not a coincidence that several countries which the Rhine traverses, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Germany, are among the richest in the world. Together, Germany and the Netherlands, the last 2 countries through which the Rhine flows, export more than the United States and Mexico combined. Yet viewed across its width, the same river has also been a source of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?